Elena had always dreamed of becoming a doctor, but life had other plans. Struggling to keep her family afloat, she faced an impossible choice, one that would change her world forever. What would you do if your only way out came at a price you never expected? Stay with us until the end to uncover the truth. Subscribe now and hit the like button to support the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to read your responses. For you, it's just a second, but for us, it's the motivation to keep going. Elena adjusted the thin strap of her worn-out backpack as she trudged down the cracked sidewalk of her neighborhood. The weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than the books she carried. The city air was thick with exhaust fumes, mingling with the scent of fried food from street vendors. The rhythmic tapping of her sneakers on the pavement was the only sound she allowed herself to focus on. At 22, Elena was a medical student juggling long hours at university with grueling shifts as a waitress. Dreams of becoming a doctor had once fueled her every move, inspired by the countless hours she had spent caring for her sick mother and younger siblings. But lately, that dream felt impossibly distant. Her home, a cramped apartment bursting at the seams with people and problems, offered no reprieve. Her mother, once strong and independent, was now frail, struggling with diabetes they couldn't afford to treat properly. Her younger brother, Marcus, 13, was restless and always in trouble at school, desperate for guidance Elena didn't have the time to provide. Little Ava, just 7, was too young to understand the depths of their struggle, but old enough to sense it. Then there was the rent. The landlord had come knocking again, his patience wearing thin. 2 weeks. That was all they had before they were evicted. That evening, as Elena returned home from another grueling shift, she found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, hands trembling around a cup of tea. "Elena, we need to talk," she said softly. Elena set her bag down, her pulse quickening at the tone in her mother's voice. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had heard them before, when the doctor had told them her mother's condition was worsening, when the electricity had been cut off, when another bill had arrived that they couldn't afford to pay. She sank into the chair across from her mother, forcing herself to meet her tired eyes. "What is it, Mom?" Her mother hesitated, glancing toward the small living room where Marcus and Ava were watching TV. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "The landlord came again today." Elena stiffened. She knew what was coming. "He's given us 2 weeks," her mother continued, her voice trembling. "If we don't have the money by then—" She trailed off, but she didn't have to finish. Elena's mind raced. 2 weeks. Rent was already months overdue. Even if she picked up extra shifts, there was no way she could earn enough in time. "I'll figure something out," she said quickly. Her mother shook her head. "You're already doing too much. You can't keep this up, Elena. I see how exhausted you are." A knock at the door interrupted them. Elena frowned, pushing back from the table. It was late. When she opened the door, her uncle, Vincent, stood there. A gruff man in his 50s, he smelled of truck grease and stale coffee, his thick arms crossed over his chest. He rarely visited, and his sudden appearance filled Elena with unease. "Uncle Vincent," she greeted, stepping aside to let him in. "What are you doing here?" He walked past her, surveying the apartment with a critical eye before sinking into a chair. "I came to talk," he said. "It's important." Elena sat down, wary. "What is it?" Vincent leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know things are hard for y'all," he began, "and I've been thinking about how I can help." Elena's stomach twisted. She knew Vincent. He never did anything without a reason. "I got a proposition for you," he said, meeting her gaze. She didn't like the sound of that. "There's a man I used to work for," Vincent continued. "Rich, real rich. Lives in this big old house on the other side of town." Elena frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" Vincent exhaled, as if choosing his next words carefully. "He's looking for a wife." Silence filled the room. Elena blinked, thinking she had misheard. "A wife?" Vincent nodded. "Yeah, he's an old guy. 65, I think. Got some kind of illness, so he ain't got much time left. But he's willing to pay real good money for someone to marry him." Elena stared at him in shock. "You're not serious." "I'm dead serious," Vincent said. "He don't want no romance or nothing, just a legal arrangement. He'll take care of you, your mama, the kids, everything. And when he goes, you get the inheritance." Elena's skin prickled. The idea was absurd, insulting even. "Why would he do this?" she asked. "He's got his reasons," Vincent said vaguely. "But that don't matter. What matters is that this could solve all your problems." Elena's pulse pounded in her ears. She looked at her mother, who sat frozen, lips pressed tightly together. "I know it's a lot to think about," Vincent said, "but you ain't got a lot of options. You need money. He needs a wife. It's a business deal, plain and simple." Elena's breath came in short, uneven bursts. She had spent her whole life trying to make it on her own, trying to carve out a future for herself and her family. And now, here she was, being offered a way out. Her pride screamed at her to say no, to tell Vincent to leave and never bring this up again. But then she thought about her mother, about Marcus and Ava, about the eviction notice, the hospital bills, the endless struggle. This wasn't the life she wanted, but maybe it was the only way to save the people she loved. Vincent stood, pulling a card from his pocket. "Think about it," he said, placing it on the table. "I'll set up a meeting. If you want to go through with it, you'll see him yourself." Elena didn't move as he walked out the door. The card sat in front of her, taunting her. When she finally picked it up, her hands were shaken. She read the name, printed in elegant gold letters, Richard Caldwell. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. By morning, she had made her decision. She would meet him. Elena stood outside the towering iron gates of the Caldwell estate, gripping the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The grandeur of the mansion before her was suffocating, its towering presence making her feel impossibly small. It looked like something out of a movie, a sprawling estate with manicured lawns, marble fountains, and towering oak trees that lined the driveway. Everything about it screamed wealth, power, and control. Her uncle, Vincent, gave her a curt nod before stepping back toward his truck. "You sure about this?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. Elena swallowed hard and nodded. She wasn't sure at all, but what choice did she have? The wrought iron gates creaked open slowly, as if to emphasize the weight of what she was about to do. A uniformed man, tall and expressionless, emerged from a small booth beside the entrance and gestured for her to follow the cobblestone path toward the main house. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, her nerves clawing at her stomach with every breath. The front door, massive and made of dark oak, swung open before she could knock. A butler, impeccably dressed in a black suit, greeted her with a polite nod. His expression remained neutral, as if the situation was as normal as any other part of his daily duties. "Miss Elena, I presume?" he asked in a smooth, practiced tone. "Yes," she said, her voice coming out softer than she had intended. "Mr. Caldwell is expecting you. Please follow me." She stepped inside and the air changed instantly. The interior of the mansion was even more overwhelming than the outside. High ceilings stretched above her, adorned with crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, family portraits, and antique furniture that looked too pristine to be touched. Despite the luxury, an unsettling stillness filled the space. There was no laughter, no music, no signs of life beyond the flickering of candlelight in the distant corridors. Elena followed the butler through a long hallway, her eyes darting around, trying to take in the unfamiliar surroundings while keeping her nerves in check. Finally, they arrived at a set of large double doors. The butler knocked twice before pushing them open, revealing a spacious study bathed in warm, golden light. The scent of aged wood and leather filled the room. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, and a large mahogany desk stood near a window that overlooked the back garden. Behind the desk sat the man she was here to meet, Richard Caldwell. He was nothing like she had imagined. Elena had expected an old, frail man on the verge of death, but instead she was met with someone who still carried the air of strength and authority. He was tall, his posture straight and disciplined. His silver-white hair was neatly combed, and though his face bore the deep lines of age, his piercing blue eyes were sharp and observant, studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Miss Elena," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Please, have a seat." She hesitated for a brief moment before stepping into the room and lowering herself onto the chair across from him. Richard's gaze never wavered. He folded his hands on the desk, his fingers interlocked as if carefully considering his next words. "You must be nervous," he said, finally, breaking the silence. "I can't blame you. The situation is unconventional, to say the least." Elena nodded slightly, unsure of what to say. Her voice felt stuck in her throat, so she simply waited for him to continue. "I understand that your uncle explained the arrangement to you," Richard said, his tone calm and businesslike. "I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not looking for a romantic partner, nor am I interested in any kind of physical relationship. What I need is a legal spouse, someone who can fulfill the basic requirements of marriage on paper." Elena swallowed, trying to keep her emotions in check. "In return," he continued, "I will ensure that you and your family are taken care of. Your mother will receive the medical care she needs. Your siblings will be provided for. The debt that burdens you will be erased." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if he were offering her a simple business deal rather than a life-altering decision. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice steadier than she expected. Richard tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question carefully. "Your uncle spoke highly of your character," he said. "He told me you are intelligent, hard-working, and selfless, qualities I admire." Elena wasn't sure how to respond. She wasn't used to being described in such flattering terms, and she certainly wasn't used to a billionaire looking at her as if she was anything other than a desperate girl in need of money. "And," he added, leaning back slightly, "if I may be blunt, I was drawn to the idea of helping someone who genuinely needs it." Elena blinked. She hadn't expected that. For a long moment, she studied him. He didn't seem threatening, nor did he seem like the manipulative type. If anything, there was something distant about him, as though he were already somewhere far away in his mind. "I need some time to think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But if you choose to proceed, understand that this will be a binding agreement. I expect honesty and discretion." He reached for a folder on his desk and slid it across to her. This contains the details of the arrangement. Review it carefully. If you decide to move forward, contact my assistant and we'll make the necessary preparations." Elena hesitated before taking the folder, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather as she stood to leave. Richard rose from his chair as well and extended his hand. She shook it reluctantly, surprised by how steady and warm his grip was. "Good luck, Miss Elena," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Whatever you decide, I hope it brings you peace." As the butler escorted her back to the front door, Elena's mind raced with conflicting emotions. The meeting had gone differently than she had expected, but she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Richard Caldwell was an enigma, cold and detached on the surface, yet there was something about him that felt genuine. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, something he wasn't telling her. When she stepped back out into the crisp evening air, the folder in her hand felt heavier with each passing second, a physical reminder of the crossroads she now stood at. Her family needed her, but at what cost? Could she really go through with this arrangement and marry a man she barely knew? As she walked away from the mansion, her heart and mind were locked in a battle she wasn't sure she could win. The day Elena moved into Richard Caldwell's mansion, the sky was an ominous gray, mirroring the storm of emotions raging inside her. She had spent the last few nights lying awake in her family's cramped apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her meeting with Richard. The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket, but in the end, the image of her mother's relieved smile and her siblings' laughter when she told them everything would be okay had solidified her choice. Now, standing at the gates of the estate once again, she felt like a stranger in her own skin. The black SUV that had picked her up from her old neighborhood pulled away, leaving her alone with nothing but a single suitcase and a contract that had changed the course of her life. The butler, Mr. Calloway, greeted her with the same polite bow as before. "Miss Elena, welcome. Your room is ready. Shall I show you the way?" Elena nodded, her grip tightening on the handle of her suitcase. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice almost drowned out by the echo of her own footsteps against the marble floors as she followed him inside. The mansion was as pristine and overwhelming as she remembered. The walls, adorned with art and framed photographs, told the story of a family that no longer seemed to exist. The silence was even more palpable now that she knew she would be living here. Mr. Calloway led her up a grand staircase, down a long hallway, and finally stopped in front of a door at the far end. He pushed it open, revealing a spacious bedroom bathed in soft, natural light. The furnishings were elegant but simple. A large bed with crisp white linens, a writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that dwarfed the suitcase in her hand. "This will be your room," Mr. Calloway said, placing a key on the desk. "Mr. Caldwell prefers his privacy, so your quarters are on the opposite side of the house from his. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." Elena nodded again, unsure of what to say. She thanked him quietly as he left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking in her surroundings. The room was beautiful, far nicer than anything she had ever known, but it didn't feel like hers. It felt temporary, as if she were merely a guest in someone else's world. She set her suitcase down beside the wardrobe and walked over to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains. The view overlooked the garden, where neatly trimmed hedges and a small fountain stood in the center. In the distance, she could see an older man tending to the plants, his movements methodical and precise. Everything about this place was orderly, controlled, nothing like the chaos of her old life. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see a middle-aged woman standing in the doorway, a kind smile on her face and an apron tied around her waist. "Hello, dear," the woman said warmly. "I'm Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper. I just wanted to introduce myself and see if you needed anything." Elena forced a small smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Porter. I'm fine, thank you." Mrs. Porter's smile widened. "You must be overwhelmed. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? But don't worry, you'll get used to it. And if you need anything at all, just let me know." Elena murmured her thanks, appreciating the woman's warmth but also feeling an uncomfortable weight in her chest. She wasn't sure she wanted to get used to this. Once Mrs. Porter left, Elena sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. The reality of her new life was beginning to sink in, and with it came a wave of uncertainty. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, despite the fact that it was only the two of them. Richard sat at the head of the long dining table, dressed in a tailored suit despite the informality of the occasion. He was the picture of composure, every movement deliberate and precise. Elena, on the other hand, felt out of place. She had changed into one of the dresses that had been left for her in the wardrobe, a simple but elegant navy blue gown that felt foreign against her skin. "You're settling in, I trust?" Richard asked as the butler served the first course. "Yes, thank you," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Richard nodded. "If you find anything lacking, let Mr. Calloway or Mrs. Porter know. They are here to ensure your comfort." The meal continued in near silence, broken only by the occasional clink of silverware against porcelain. Elena found herself stealing glances at Richard, trying to decipher the man behind the composed exterior. He ate slowly, methodically, his posture impeccable. Yet there was a weariness to him, an unspoken heaviness that lingered in the air around him. When dinner was over, Richard rose from his seat. "You're free to explore the house and grounds as you wish," he said. "Just respect the staff's spaces and avoid my study unless invited. Good night, Miss Elena." Elena watched as he walked away, his steps steady but deliberate, as though each movement required effort. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of life he had led to end up here, alone in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. The following days settled into a routine. Elena would wake early, eat breakfast in the sunlit kitchen with Mrs. Porter fussing over her, and spend her mornings wandering the mansion. Each room held a piece of history: antique furniture, faded photographs, bookshelves filled with volumes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. She spent afternoons in the garden, where the gardener, an older man named Mr. Grayson, would greet her with a friendly nod but few words. Richard remained a distant presence, appearing only during meals or in passing. He was always polite, always formal, but never overly familiar. Elena couldn't decide if his demeanor was meant to make her comfortable or to keep her at arm's length. One evening, as she wandered the halls, she stumbled upon a small music room. A grand piano sat in the center, its polished surface gleaming under the soft light of a chandelier. Curious, she approached it, running her fingers lightly over the keys. The sound that emerged was soft, almost hesitant, but it filled the empty room like a whisper. "You play." The voice startled her, and she turned to see Richard standing in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back. "A little," she admitted, stepping away from the piano. "Not well." He entered the room, his movements slow but purposeful, and gestured for her to sit. "Play something." Elena hesitated, but his gaze was expectant. She sat down and began to play a simple melody, her fingers fumbling slightly on the keys. When she finished, she glanced up at him, unsure of what to expect. Richard nodded. "You have talent. With practice, you could be very good." Elena blinked. surprised by the compliment. It was the first time he had spoken to her with anything resembling warmth. From that moment, something shifted between them. Richard remained reserved, but there were small cracks in his armor, moments when he let his guard down just enough for Elena to catch a glimpse of the man beneath. And while the mansion still felt foreign, she began to find small pockets of comfort within its walls. But even as she settled into this new life, a nagging feeling lingered at the back of her mind. Richard's illness, though never mentioned, was impossible to ignore. His quiet moments of fatigue, the way he sometimes winced when he thought no one was looking. It was as if he were carrying a secret too heavy to share. And Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this life, like everything else, was only temporary. The rain pattered softly against the windows as Elena woke up, the gray morning light filtering through the heavy curtains. The mansion was unusually quiet, even more so than usual. She lay still for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of her new life pressing down on her. Though she had begun to settle into her routine at the Caldwell estate, the sense of displacement never left her. Everything still felt borrowed. The luxurious room, the extravagant meals, the elegant dresses waiting in her wardrobe. She was surrounded by wealth beyond anything she had ever known, yet she felt like a ghost drifting through a world that wasn't hers. Slipping out of bed, she wrapped a robe around herself and wandered down the grand hallways toward the library. It had quickly become her favorite place in the mansion. The towering bookshelves, the warm glow of the lamps, and the faint scent of old pages made it feel like a sanctuary. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, letting the stillness of the room calm her thoughts. But before she could lose herself in the comfort of her surroundings, a deep voice interrupted her. "Enjoying the library, I see?" Elena nearly jumped, turning to see Richard standing in the doorway. She hadn't heard him approach. His usual tailored suit had been replaced by a charcoal gray sweater and slacks, a rare departure from his formal attire. Yet, despite his relaxed appearance, there was something different about him today, something heavier in the way he carried himself. "It's my favorite room," she admitted, closing the book in her lap. "There's so much history here." Richard stepped further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He gestured to the seat opposite hers. "May I?" She nodded, and he lowered himself into the chair with a quiet sigh. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to tap against the windows, filling the silence between them. "This house does have history," Richard said, his gaze drifting toward the shelves, "though most of it is not as glamorous as it may seem." Elena tilted her head, intrigued by the sudden openness in his tone. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "When people look at a place like this, they see wealth, success, stability," he said. "What they don't see are the sacrifices, the mistakes, and the regrets that built it." He paused, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "I've lived here alone for the better part of a decade. It's a big house for one person." Elena hesitated, unsure if she should ask the question lingering on the tip of her tongue. But curiosity won out. "Why alone?" she asked gently. "Didn't you have a family?" A faint, bittersweet smile crossed Richard's lips. "I did, once," he admitted. "My parents immigrated to this country with nothing but hope and a willingness to work hard. They built a life here, brick by brick. I inherited their drive, but not their wisdom. I chased success at the expense of everything else. My marriage fell apart. I never had children. By the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late." Elena felt a pang of sympathy. She had spent so much time thinking of him as a distant, unknowable figure that she hadn't considered the weight he carried. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Richard met her gaze, his blue eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "Don't be," he replied. "I made my choices. I live with them." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the armrests. "But enough about me," he said, his voice shifting. "Tell me about you, Elena. What brought you here, besides circumstance?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that in such a direct way before. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I guess I've always felt responsible for my family," she began, her voice tentative. "My mom's been sick for a long time, and my siblings depend on me. Going to medical school was supposed to be my way of making things better for all of us. But it's hard to focus on your dreams when reality keeps pulling you back." Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "And now you found yourself here, in a place you never imagined," he said. Elena managed a small smile. "Something like that." Another stretch of silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt as though they were both processing the weight of their respective lives, the choices, the compromises, the regrets. Then Richard's expression turned more serious. "Elena," he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I've been meaning to for some time." Her heart skipped a beat. There was something in his tone that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What is it?" she asked. He exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not a healthy man," he admitted. "I'm sure you've noticed." Elena nodded slowly, her throat dry. She had seen the signs, the way he tired easily, the occasional wince of pain when he thought no one was looking. "I have a terminal illness," Richard said simply. "The doctors have given me months, maybe less." Elena inhaled sharply, her chest tightening. She had suspected he was ill, but hearing it confirmed was different. It was real now. "I've come to terms with it," Richard continued, his voice steady but tinged with resignation. "But I felt it was only fair to tell you." Elena swallowed, past the lump in her throat. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He gave a slight, humorless smile. "Would it have changed anything?" She wanted to say yes. She wanted to say that she would not have agreed to this arrangement if she had known the truth. But deep down, she wasn't sure that was true. "I didn't bring you here for pity," Richard said. "I wanted to do something meaningful with the time I had left. Helping you, helping your family, makes this bearable." Tears stung Elena's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Does anyone else know?" she asked. Richard shook his head. "Only my doctors." Elena's mind raced. She had walked into this arrangement thinking it was a cold, calculated business deal. Now she realized it was something else entirely. "You should have told me," she said quietly. "I know," Richard admitted, "but I needed to be sure that you were here because you wanted to be, not because you felt obligated." Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment, absorbing his words. When she opened them, Richard was watching her closely, as if waiting for her reaction. She had agreed to marry him out of necessity. Now, standing at the precipice of a truth she hadn't been prepared for, she realized that necessity had changed. The contract had been a transaction, but now it was something more. Something neither of them had expected. And for the first time since she had stepped into this house, Elena wasn't sure if she wanted to leave. Elena sat by the window of the library, staring out at the rain-soaked garden, her mind replaying Richard's words over and over. I have a terminal illness. The doctors have given me months, maybe less. She had expected her life to change the moment she signed the contract, but not like this. The arrangement had seemed clear-cut. Marry a stranger, secure her family's future, and endure whatever followed. But now, the reality of Richard's condition shifted everything. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about him. That night at dinner, she couldn't ignore the way Richard's hands trembled slightly when he reached for his glass. It was subtle, but now that she knew the truth, she saw it everywhere. The exhaustion behind his eyes, the way he sometimes rubbed his temple as if warding off a headache. She put her fork down and studied him. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked softly. Richard's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze. "Because I didn't want your pity." "It's not pity," Elena said firmly. "It's understanding." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard set his knife and fork down with deliberate precision. "I appreciate that," he said simply. It was the first honest moment between them that didn't feel transactional. In the following days, their interactions became less formal, more natural. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. Elena found herself seeking his company, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. Despite his illness, Richard carried himself with quiet dignity, a man who had lived through a great deal but spoke of very little. One evening, as she wandered the halls, she heard music drifting from the music room, the soft, haunting melody of the piano. Intrigued, she followed the sound. She found Richard seated at the grand piano, his fingers moving effortlessly over the keys. His expression was peaceful, as if the music transported him somewhere else entirely. Elena hesitated in the doorway, not wanting to disturb him, but he must have sensed her presence. "You didn't tell me you could play," she said softly. Richard glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You never asked." She stepped closer, watching his hands as they glided over the keys. "You're really good." "It's something I learned as a boy," he said. "My mother insisted. She said music had a way of speaking to the soul." Elena nodded, understanding. "Would you like to try?" Richard asked, moving to make space for her. She hesitated. "I'm not nearly as good as you." "It's not about skill," he said. "It's about expression." Slowly, she sat beside him, her fingers hovering over the keys. She played a simple melody, one she had learned as a child but hadn't touched in years. Richard listened intently, his presence steady, reassuring. When she finished, he nodded approvingly. "You have a natural touch." Elena laughed softly. "I think you're just being polite." "Not at all," Richard said. "With practice, you could be very good." A warmth spread through her chest at his words. It wasn't just a compliment. It was encouragement, something she hadn't felt in a long time. As the days passed, their conversations deepened. Richard spoke of his past, his mistakes, his regrets. He told her about the business empire he had built, how he had sacrificed relationships in the pursuit of success. "It took me too long to realize that wealth means nothing if you have no one to share it with," he admitted one evening as they sat in the garden. Elena, in turn, opened up about her family, her mother's illness, her struggles to provide for her siblings, her dream of becoming a doctor that had felt so far away until now. "You shouldn't give up on that dream," Richard said. Elena sighed. "I don't even know if it's possible anymore." Richard's gaze was steady. "It is, if you decide it is." His words stayed with her long after their conversation ended. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Richard turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "There's something I want to do," he said. Elena raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I want to write a letter, a sort of testament, not just for the estate, but for the people I've known, the life I've lived." Elena nodded, understanding the weight of his request. "I'd be honored to help." Over the next few days, they worked together, crafting his final message to the world. Richard spoke openly, dictating his thoughts while Elena transcribed them. He spoke of the lessons he had learned, the things he wished he had done differently. He acknowledged the people he had wronged, the mistakes he had made. For Elena, the experience was both humbling and transformative. She began to see her own life through a different lens. She had spent so long living in survival mode, never allowing herself to dream beyond the immediate struggles of her family. But now, with Richard's guidance, she was starting to see that she had a future worth fighting for. One evening, after they had finished the letter, Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've changed since you arrived," he said. Elena smiled slightly. "So have you." He chuckled. "Perhaps, but it's a good change." She met his gaze, and for the first time, she truly saw him, not just as the wealthy stranger she had married, but as a man. A flawed, complicated, deeply human man who had found redemption in the most unexpected way. The bond between them had grown beyond the contract that had brought them together. It was no longer about obligation. It was about understanding. It was about something real. And for the first time, Elena wasn't afraid of what came next. The days following the completion of Richard's letter carried a quiet but undeniable shift in the atmosphere of the mansion. Elena felt it in the way he carried himself, lighter in some ways, yet undeniably weaker. His illness was progressing. Though he never openly acknowledged it, the signs were there. He tired more easily, his steps slower, his once steady hands occasionally trembling when he reached for his glass or turned a page of his book. Yet, despite it all, he remained composed. One morning, as Elena sat in the sunlit garden with a book, Richard joined her. He walked carefully, a quiet effort in each step, but he still carried the same air of dignity that he always had. "You seem peaceful today," she noted as he sat beside her on the stone bench. Richard exhaled, his gaze on the fountain in the distance. "I suppose I am." Elena studied him. "Because of the letter?" "In part," he admitted, "but mostly because of you." She frowned slightly. "Me?" Richard turned to look at her. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again." "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Purpose," he said simply. "A reason to leave something behind that actually matters." Elena felt her chest tighten. She had spent so much time thinking about how Richard had changed her life that she hadn't stopped to consider how she might have changed his. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the fountain and the chirping birds filling the space between them. Then, after a moment, Richard spoke again. "There's something else I want to do," he said. Elena turned to him. "What is it?" He hesitated before meeting her gaze. "I want to leave you something, more than just the estate, more than money." Elena's stomach twisted. "Richard," he lifted a hand, silencing her gently. "Please, let me finish." She nodded, swallowing her emotions. "You're still young," he said. "You have a whole life ahead of you. But I know that life hasn't been easy for you. You've carried burdens that most people your age shouldn't have to." Elena's throat tightened. "I can't change what's happened to you," Richard continued, "but I can give you something to build from. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, ornate key. "This," he said, handing it to her, "is for a chest in my study. Inside, you'll find letters, documents, and personal records, pieces of my life that I've kept over the years." Elena stared at the key in her palm. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because," Richard said, "I trust you to do something meaningful with it." The words sent a wave of emotions crashing through her. She had entered this arrangement thinking she was simply playing a role in a business transaction. But now, Richard was giving her something far greater than money. He was giving her a responsibility, a legacy. She closed her fingers around the key and looked up at him. "I won't waste it," she promised. Richard nodded. "I know you won't." That evening, after Richard had retired to his room, Elena made her way to his study. She found the chest easily. It was tucked in the corner of the room, made of dark mahogany with golden accents. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked and she lifted the lid. Inside, she found stacks of letters, faded photographs, and old journals filled with Richard's handwriting. She picked up the first letter and unfolded it carefully. It was addressed to her. "Elena, if you are reading this, it means I have left this world. But know that I did so at peace, knowing that I had the chance to meet you. I don't know what the future holds for you, but I do know that you are stronger than you realize. You have a kindness that this world desperately needs, and a resilience that will carry you through whatever comes next. This chest contains the stories of my life, the mistakes I've made, the lessons I've learned, and the people I've loved. I hope you find meaning in them. More than that, I hope you find yourself. Live boldly, love fiercely, and never forget your worth." With gratitude, Richard tears blurred Elena's vision as she clutched the letter to her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for the man she had come to know, but for the life he had lived and the time they hadn't been given. She had entered this marriage expecting nothing but a contract. Instead, she had found a friend, a mentor. And now she had been given a final gift, the chance to take all he had left behind and turn it into something greater. She wiped her tears, carefully placed the letter back into the chest, and closed the lid. She wasn't sure what she was going to do next, but she knew one thing for certain. She would honor his legacy, and she would make sure it meant something. The morning after Richard's passing, the mansion felt emptier than ever. The silence, once comforting in its predictability, was now unbearable. Elena sat in the study, Richard's final letter still clutched in her hands. The weight of his words, his trust, and his legacy pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. She had spent so much of her life surviving. Now, for the first time, she had the means to truly live. But how? She glanced at the chest Richard had left her, filled with the fragments of his past, his regrets, his lessons, his hopes, and in that moment, she knew exactly what she had to do. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of movement. With the help of Richard's lawyer, she began settling his estate. As expected, he had left her everything: the mansion, the wealth, the business assets. But Elena didn't care about the money. What mattered to her was what she could do with it. She reached out to organizations, met with architects and community leaders, and drafted a plan that felt like the only right thing to do. She was going to turn the Caldwell estate into something meaningful. A safe haven. A second chance for people like her family. Those who had struggled, who had fought, who had needed just one opportunity to change their lives. And she would make sure they got it. On the day of the grand opening, Elena stood at the entrance of what had once been a cold, lifeless mansion. Now it was a thriving community center. The grand halls, once silent, were filled with voices. Families walked through the doors, some seeking shelter, others looking for education, for support, for hope. Richard's old study had been transformed into a library. The dining hall, once used for stiff, formal dinners, was now a gathering space where people shared meals, laughter, and stories. Elena stood at the podium in the garden, looking out at the crowd that had gathered for the ceremony. Volunteers, staff, families in need, people who had been touched by Richard's generosity without even knowing his name. She took a deep breath and began. "This place is more than just a building," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling inside her. "It's a promise." A hush fell over the crowd as she continued. "A promise that no one will be turned away, that every person who walks through these doors will find help, support, and hope." She glanced up at the large portrait of Richard that had been placed at the entrance. "And it's all because of one man who believed that life isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you leave behind." The audience erupted into applause, their faces glowing with appreciation. Elena stepped back from the microphone, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She had done it. She had honored him. And, in the process, she had found her own purpose. That night, long after the last guest had left, Elena sat in the music room. The grand piano stood in the center of the room, untouched since the last time Richard had played. She ran her fingers over the keys, pressing down gently, letting the melody fill the empty space. It was the same tune he had played for her once, the same tune he had asked her to play. As the last note lingered in the air, she closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything, for believing in her, for showing her that she was worth more than just survival." As she stood and turned off the light, she glanced out the window. The first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of gold and pink. A new day was coming, a new beginning, and for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She was ready to live, to build, to carry forward the legacy Richard had left behind, to create something extraordinary. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Also, tell us where you're watching from. It's just a second for you, but for us, it's the motivation to create more amazing content.